Hi everyone, I'm Elvira, and today I'll share with you a foolproof method for predicting the future of Russia and other countries with similar systems. I've watched plenty of English language analysis where scholars with great confidence try to decode the minds of Russian officials and unravel the logic behind their actions. The problem is that these interpretations often have little to do with reality. They assume Russia's top officials share the same intellectual foundation and worldview as their analysts themselves. But here's the truth. Those officials did not attend institutions like Oxford or Harvard, and they did not read the same books or articles. Their worldview is entirely different. Most of these officials were educated in the Soviet era, a time when the humanities were heavily stifled by ideology and barely existed as serious academic fields. As a result, Russia's ruling elite missed decades of progress in Western philosophical and social thought. They are still operating with an ideological framework rooted in the 1950s. You can hear it in their interviews, where they literally repeat outdated ideas word to word. Have they caught up in recent years now that Western books on sociology, philosophy, and political science are widely available? Not at all. Their skill set is tailored to something entirely different, surviving and maneuvering with a dangerous and cutthroat political environment where power is about controlling resources and outmaneuvering rivals. Strategic planning or embracing modern values simply isn't part of the job. And then there is the critical piece. Top officials in Russia detest hearing unpleasant truths. That's why they are driving out leading economists, sociologists, demographers, and political scientists, labeling them as foreign agents. These individuals face harsh restrictions and are shut out of public discourse. Unsurprisingly, Russian officials rely heavily on state-sponsored television for their information. The same TV that pushes propaganda designed to manipulate, not enlighten. This creates an informational bubble where officials reinforce their own fantasies, cut off from their realities outside their echo chamber. So while Western analysts might imagine deep, intricate plans at play, the truth is often much simpler. Russia's top officials operate in a world shaped by outdated ideas, misinformation, and their own immediate survival tactics. Their reality is far removed from the narratives projected onto them. The true motivations of Russia's leadership boil down to three key factors. First, staying in power. Their top priority is clinging to their positions or climbing higher, not in your eyes, but in the eyes of their peers. They know little about you because they don't engage with you, don't read about you, and don't speak your language. Nor do they care to know you. They believe they already understand everything. After all, they are the big bosses, and in their view, that authority is validation enough. Second, the need to impress. There is a deep-seated national urge to astonish and inspire, and this is not an exaggeration. Russia has a long history of sacrificing practicality and even prosperity to project an image of greatness. Monumental palaces, colossal construction projects, lavish celebrations, and costly wars may yield little tangible benefit, but serve to boost the country's self-esteem. The narrative is clear. We are a great nation. However, they are not trying to impress you. They don't understand you, nor do they try to. Instead, they act on what they think will impress you, assuming you share their values. Third, access to resources. This is the most critical factor. All the grand ambitions of Russian leaders hinge on one thing: money. And in Russia, money has always been a complicated affair. Running a sprawling nation like Russia is astronomically expensive. Heating, transportation, and manufacturing require immense energy, leaving little room for savings. Historically, the average Russian citizen has been far poorer than their European counterparts because so much of their effort goes into merely sustaining basic life conditions. The country's vast, sparsely populated territories, long borders, and lack of navigable waterways further weaken internal economic connectivity. For a more detailed breakdown, check out this video. As a result, Russia's domestic market is small, and taxes collected barely suffice to meet the needs of its citizens, local elites, and the security forces required to keep the system in check. If we examine the broad trends in Russian history, a fascinating pattern comes into focus. When Russia isolates itself from the world, it becomes a quiet, impoverished state in Eastern Europe that rarely antagonizes its neighbors. However, when it opens up to global trade, the story changes. Its citizens remain poor, but the ruling class rapidly amasses wealth. With this newfound fortune, the rulers build armies and embark on grandiose projects to consolidate power and dazzle the world. This dynamic explains the rise of monumental ventures like the construction of St. Petersburg, the conquest of Siberia and Central Asia, and even the colonization of Russian Alaska. Yes, Alaska was once Russian territory. To predict where Russia is heading, focus on its foreign trade. It's the lifeline of the ruling elite's super profits, funding their ambitious wars and monumental undertakings. Since the 16th century, Russia's foreign trade has revolved around key choke points, starting with the northern port city of Arkhangelsk. With few alternative trade routes, the government tightly controlled or outright monopolized highly profitable goods, cementing its dominance over lucrative exports. Russia's prosperity has always hinged on events in European states, its primary trading partners. Let's explore the details because the devil truly lies in their outlook nuances. In the 16th and 17th century, Russia's main exports were wax, furs, and honey. This period coincided with the Reformation in Europe, which brought rising literacy rates and consequently a growing demand for candles. Meanwhile, Spain was colonizing the Americas, flooding Europe with silver and gold from the New World, enriching its aristocracy. However, Spain's domestic industries lagged behind, so wealthy Spaniards turned to neighbors like England and France to purchase fine textiles, furniture, and other luxury goods. This trade created a class of wealthy artisans and merchants in Western Europe who developed a taste for exotic luxuries, like Russian furs and honey. By the 18th century, Russia had taken a dramatic leap forward. It waged successful wars and, most significantly, defeated Sweden to secure access to the Baltic Sea. But where did the money for these grand achievements come from? Funding armies, buying weapons, building domestic arm factories, and paying foreign specialists invited by Peter the Great required enormous resources. These specialists demanded and received higher wages than they would have earned at home. After all, few were eager to relocate to Russia's distant and unforgiving terrain. The explanation for this financial miracle lies in trade. At the time, Russia's key partners were Holland and England, both deeply engaged in colonial expansion and naval development. By the 18th century, however, Western Europe's forests had largely vanished. The iconic English landscape of rolling green hills was once densely forested, but deforestation had reduced woodlands to a few hunting reserves. Navies, however, still had to be built. Russia stepped in as a critical supplier of timber, hemp, flax, and iron, thanks to discovery of vast iron deposits in the Ural Mountains. Meanwhile, fur remained a highly sought-after commodity, as Europe's deforestation led to the decline of animals like the European beaver, Eurasian lynx, and European mink. Russia's natural resources became the lifeblood of European industry and naval power. fueling its own rise as a formidable player on the global stage. In the 18th century, Russia secured access to Black Sea ports and conquered the fertile lands of Ukraine and the wild steppe. These acquisitions transformed Russia into a major grain exporter. Grain prices steadily climbed due to Europe's growing population, urbanization, frequent wars, epidemics, and crop failures, such as the infamous potato famine. The revenues from grain exports funded the creation of a massive army and established a strict police state within Russia. Under Tsar Nicholas I, Russia wielded immense power over half of Europe, not only through its military strength, but also by threatening to withhold grain from Europe's rapidly growing urban centers. The Crimean War, 1853-1856, disrupted Russia's grain exports to Europe, creating an opening for the United States. Leveraging its expansive river systems and burgeoning railroad networks, the US efficiently connected fertile agricultural regions to ports. Technological advancements allowed American grain to be shipped across the Atlantic more cheaply than it could be transported from Russia. Following its humiliating defeat in the Crimean War, Russia required several years to rebuild its economy and revive its expansionist ambitions. This recovery was significantly bolstered by Europe's rapid urbanization and industrialization, which created a growing dependency on Russian grain, timber, metals, and other raw materials to sustain its burgeoning industries. Russia's own industrial growth at the turn of the 19th and 20th century relied heavily on these export revenues. However, this economic boom scarcely benefited the vast majority of the Russian population, which continued to subsist on small-scale farming and often didn't encounter actual money until the 1960s. The Russian economy crumbled entirely after the Bolshevik Revolution. The new rulers promised prosperity, but the reality was starkly different. Factories ground to a halt, cities were abandoned, and the nation regressed to an almost archaic state. As one contemporary observer noted, even basic items like eyeglass screws or new pencils were impossible to find. The Bolshevik government's refusal to honor Tsarist debts triggered a trade embargo, causing grain exports to plummet tenfold and plunging the country into years of profound poverty. While the Civil War and Revolution contributed significantly to the devastation, the underlying issue was a complete lack of funds to develop any meaningful industry. Meanwhile, Russia's former dominance in the global grain market was swiftly overtaken by the United States, Canada, and Argentina. In the 1920s, Russia's foreign trade limped along, sustained primarily by exporting grain and raw materials to Germany. In 1922, Germany recognized the USSR and signed a trade agreement which provided a modest boost to its own post-World War I economy. For Russia, however, the shortages were crippling. Tractors, basic machinery, and even the smallest items like scissors and needles were in critically short supply. Smuggling became a lifeline, and eastern Poland, newly liberated from Russian rule, reaped significant profits as a hub for black market trade. How did Russia eventually build the powerful Red Army that defeated the Nazis? When Stalin came to power, he initiated a massive industrialization campaign funded through the ruthless exploitation of the peasantry. Land and private property were confiscated, and farmers were forced into collective farms, essentially state-run enterprises. This policy led to widespread famine, the mass migration of young people from villages, and persistent food shortages in cities. At the same time, goods produced by Gulag prisoners, such as timber, metals, and other raw materials, were exported to foreign markets. This legalized system of forced labor was specifically designed to fuel industrial growth and generate export revenue. If you are curious, I have a separate video exploring this topic in depth. Why did the West enable the USSR, a nation openly proclaiming its intent to conquer the world, to build up its industry and military? The answer lies in the Great Depression of 1929, which left many Western factories, engineering firms, and specialists with few options. Supplying goods to the USSR often meant the difference between survival and bankruptcy. During World War II, the Soviet Union became an ally of the United States and the United Kingdom. As part of this alliance, the USSR received massive amounts of aid, from ambulances to aviation fuel. My grandmother, who served as a nurse during the war, often spoke of how all the surgical and bandaging materials they used came from America. Even the wounded soldiers' rations included diluted condensed milk supplied by the US. When the Cold War began, territories under US and Allied control experienced rapid reconstruction, while the USSR struggled to recover. Vast swaths of Soviet land had been burned and looted during the war, and the country lacked funds for rebuilding, especially after the new trade embargo imposed by the West. To supply its newly acquired satellite states with energy, the USSR began investing heavily in oil exploration in the 1950s. The discovery of massive reserves came at a critical time. By the 1960s, the Soviet Union had lost its primary source of internal revenue, the voiceless and powerless peasantry. Young people were abandoning rural villages for cities, leaving behind aging populations that were gradually dying off. While the Bolsheviks had promised to build a utopian communist society, the reality was far bleaker. Domestic agriculture was in shambles, and the nation could no longer feed itself. Desperate for foreign currency to sustain the economy, the USSR turned to its vast energy reserves. Beginning in the 1960s, the Soviet Union became a key supplier of gas and oil to Europe. Pipelines were built, and countries like Italy, West Germany, and France grew increasingly reliant on steady energy shipments from their hostile neighbor. Even amid the Cold War, the USSR struck a groundbreaking deal with the United States to purchase American grain. Without this agreement, the USSR would have faced a catastrophic food crisis as early as the 1970s. The 1973 oil crisis sent global oil prices soaring, and the USSR, flush with newfound resources, promptly funneled its wealth into an ambitious and costly venture, the war in Afghanistan. In response, the United States imposed another embargo on the USSR. However, European nations largely disregarded it, as their post-war industrial recovery heavily depended on cheap raw materials from the Soviet Union, particularly gas, which fueled countless industries. In 1985, disaster struck. Oil prices plummeted from $30 to $35 per barrel to just $15. This dramatic drop was driven by several factors: a global economic slowdown in the early 1980s, Saudi Arabia flooding the market with oil, and the aftermath of the 1973 oil crisis, which had prompted the United States to heavily invest in energy-saving technologies and expand its own oil production. The Soviet Union, heavily reliant on foreign currency from trade, could no longer sustain itself. This income had been crucial, particularly for importing food. I vividly remember the 1980s when Russian cards were issued for almost everything, from sugar to butter. The USSR, in the most literal sense, went bankrupt. Did anyone learn a lesson from this? Not at all. The cycle simply began anew. In the 1990s, as China underwent rapid industrialization, energy prices climbed once again, and Russia's treasury was flush with cash. Europe eagerly bought Russian oil and gas, yet their profits barely reached the general population. Instead, they were funneled to the upper echelon of society. And how did it all end? The same as always: war and construction, construction and war. Think World Cup stadiums, the Crimean Bridge, the President's Palace in Gelendzhik, and endless conflicts. Syria, Georgia, Ukraine. After the war in Ukraine began, Europe made monumental efforts to break its dependence on Russian oil and gas, triggering a severe economic crisis, particularly in Germany. Russia, having lost its most vital market, turned to China. Now, nearly everything in the Russian industry is either made in China or depends on Chinese components. But there is a major problem. China itself is facing a crisis of unprecedented proportions stemming from its shrinking youth population, a direct consequence of rapid urbanization, and the infamous one-child policy. This short-sighted strategy, born of leadership lacking robust education in humanities, inflicted lasting damage on the Chinese nation. The problem cannot be fixed. China cannot magically produce millions of young workers to replace those aging out of their workforce. This will inevitably lead to an industrial slowdown and with it a drop in oil prices. What will happen to Russia under such condition is not hard to guess. But this situation will persist only until the next cycle. If the West encounters significant setbacks, it will once again turn to Russia, resume trade, and the cycle will repeat itself all over again. Can this vicious cycle be broken? Yes. But first, we need to address the core reasons behind it. Resource concentration. In Russia, all resources are controlled by a tiny elite willing to destroy their country's future to cling to power indefinitely. Short-sighted policies in the West. Western nations often patch economic holes by engaging with authoritarian regimes, ignoring the long-term consequences. These deals fuel wars and refugee crises funded by the West's own money. Politicians temporarily bolster these regimes' economies only to leave the mess for the next generation to clean up. A powerless society. Russian society lacks the information, connections, and resources necessary to resist its ruling class. The elite ensures it stays this way by imprisoning, exiling, or even killing political opponents, suppressing free media, and convincing an undereducated population that all their woes are the fault of the CIA or MI6. For anyone asking why don't Russians fight for their rights, try setting an example in Moscow. You'd be arrested within 10 minutes, likely exchanged for a Russian spy after 5 years, and return home, if you are lucky, with broken kidneys, tuberculosis, and no teeth. If the West genuinely aims to prevent wars, there are only two viable options. First, cut all ties with authoritarian regimes. Without access to foreign trade, regimes like Russia would lack the funds to build armies and acquire modern weapons. However, scarcity alone won't turn Russia or any similar country into a democracy. Instead, it will spark fierce competition for remaining resources. The elite will remain cynical and secular, but the general population will be poisoned with extreme propaganda, a toxic mix of nationalism, messianic delusions, and anger. Look at Iraq, Lebanon, or Syria, for examples. Russia would follow a similar path if left isolated. While a nuclear threat remains a concern, Russia's elite are not religious fanatics. They are a mafia with mafia-like goals: power, money, and status. Such a Russia would lose its bite, especially as its population ages, shrinks, and its brightest minds flee. But is this truly the future anyone wants? Second, empower people to build an alternative Russia. The second option is to help ordinary people develop the resources and connections necessary to create a new Russia. This would take time, education, and the gradual formation of a new international identity, not from within Russia, but fostered externally. It's essentially a PR strategy with a clear message. We value you, respect you, and are ready to welcome you. Right now, the opposite is happening. The Russian population is left entirely at the mercy of the elite. Embassies are closed. Sanctions make international connections nearly impossible. And Russian citizens who do make it abroad face significant barriers. Their passports mark them as second-class humans, regardless of their beliefs. They can't use credit cards, find jobs, or open bank accounts. This isolation crushes any potential for political activism. Most people are simply trying to survive amidst these obstacles. Russian propaganda exploits this narrative brilliantly. The West hates you because you are Russian. Come back to Daddy. Nobody loves you but me. But this Daddy is a classic domestic tyrant, manipulative, isolating, and abusive. His success lies in being the breadwinner and the strongest force around. The modern world's greatest issue is that people rarely take the time to truly study and understand one another. They either don't realize it's necessary or assume they already know everything. But they don't. If you believe breaking this cycle is important, give this video a thumbs up and share your thoughts in the comments. If you are curious about Russian history, click the link below and explore my book series Russian Treasures. It unveils the intricacies of this world from the inside, and I promise you, you won't regret it.